Welcome to Elevate Your Ride, the podcast dedicated to elevating your performance in the saddle. I'm Ellie, your personal trainer.
And I'm Lauren, your mindset coach.
Today we have with us Michelle Correia, the owner of Stable Body Physical Therapy. Michelle has her doctorate of physical therapy, is a practicing clinician in outpatient orthopedics, and is a certified equine rehab practitioner. So, Michelle started her physical therapy business for horses and riders in 2020, and her goal is to optimize movement for equestrians and their equines. So I know Michelle personally because I am actually a client of hers. I reached out to Michelle about 6 months ago to help me regain some stability and some strength that I was lacking from my back injury. And she did an incredible job at evaluating me and coming up with a program for me to go through. And I've noticed a huge difference not only in my riding, but in my daily life as well. So, Michelle, can you tell us a little bit more about you and your background?
Hi, yes. Oh my gosh, that was such a sweet intro. Thank you so much. So I have been a longtime equestrian since I was in my early teens. And so I didn't grow up in a horse household, but my dad is a veterinarian. He's a small animal veterinarian. And so I grew up in like the medicine component of it. So I kind of grew up in a vet clinic, but the small animal vet clinic and always had animals around. But I was the person in my family who had the horse bug. And when I was young, started riding, fell in love with eventing. That's what I grew up doing. And the mare that I had, my longtime mare partner, was a thoroughbred off the track and was one of those horses that like always found a way to get herself injured and like had soft feet or had previous orthopedic stuff from her racing days. And so we were pretty much managing orthopedic conditions with her, keeping her happy, healthy, and moving her best. So we worked with our collaborative vet team quite a bit. And I remember we did a clinic once when I was probably 15 or 16 with a clinician who's a veterinarian. And she was doing a dressage clinic about how exercise can improve your horse's movement. So, like the specific movements in dressage, how you can tailor them to bend in on what your horse is dealing with or what you want to improve physically in them. And so she had like this horse come out that had previously sustained a pelvis fracture, and the mare was lame to start because she has like an asymmetrical pelvis. But then by the end, she was symmetrical in her hind end and the way she was moving. And it was just like through physical movement and exercise based conditioning that they were able to transition this mare from being asymmetrical and not painful to being symmetrical. And it was fascinating to me. And so, growing up with a veterinarian, I knew that I wanted to work with people and I wanted to have more of the human part of medicine because I'd seen a lot of like what the vet world looked like. And not that I didn't like it, but it's just a different world. And so I decided to go into human medicine where I fell in love with movement and anatomy. I ended up getting my bachelor's from Oregon State in exercise science and then was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with it and really saw how there's such a gap in our sport as equestrians compared to other more traditional sports, right? Football, basketball, tennis, they all have a lot of research behind them and post injury rehab programs. And they generally have strength and conditioning coaches. They generally have fitness coaches that are tailored specifically to that sport. And when I finished my undergrad, I was like, well, I'd love to see that happen for equestrians. Like, I'd love that to be a norm because as an eventer, like, I go out and cross country with my insurance information on my shoulder. Like, it boggles my mind that the amount of concussions and the amount of injury that we can have in this sport, and we don't have a professional in the industry to support that was really frustrating. So I actually went into the doctorate program wanting to bring it to equestrians and be able to bring PT and rehab to equestrians to be able to help support riders to keep moving as functionally and comfortably as possible throughout their riding career. And then it evolved to bringing in the horse. And now I treat both, which is fun. And it's a lovely puzzle. And I think that's what keeps my work really exciting and fun is that I get to spend my days out at horse barns, and the horse barn in the arena is my gym. And then my strength training is with saddles and muck buckets. And it's a different trajectory than a lot of physical therapists, but I love it.
Such a cool story and such an interesting background. I love that you work with both the horse and the rider because I think that it's, like you said, pretty rare to find personal trainers, physical therapists, that sort of support for the rider, but then to also try and find that sort of support for the horse, but then you do both. And I think that's pretty cool. So Like, I remember the first time that you came out and you kinda watched me ride around, and I thought that it was cool that you could evaluate me and the horse if I had wanted you to evaluate the horse. Like,
Yeah.
as a rider, I think that that is a really valuable service. So, can you talk a little bit about, like, maybe an experience that you've had where you've got to, like, evaluate a horse and a rider together as a pair and how you helped them?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I had planned originally, like I said, to kind of bring it to riders. I hadn't really looked that much into the equine part of it just because that pathway isn't as common. There's only two programs in the US that allow you to train for equine. And so I hadn't really looked into it. I remember when I was working with a couple riders when I was first out of my PT program. I had started working with some riders before I got my equine part of it done. And it was so fascinating because I would have a rider that would come with like hip pain. I have this one rider that sticks out in my brain as one that was really inspiring for me to go to look at both. And this rider had hip pain when they were in the canter. And it was on the left hip and it was when they were cantering to the right. And I had looked at the rider out of the saddle and screened them on the ground, look at their strength, look at their range of motion of their hip, their low back, their knee, trying to get a good idea of how their body moved outside of riding. And then I wanted to see how it looked in the saddle as well, which is typically how I look at all my evaluations. I want to put the puzzle pieces together. And their hip and their low back and their knee all moved really, really well on the ground. They had good strength. They did not have pain. But then the minute you put them in the saddle, you start having them do more impact and starting to canter. That's when their hip and pelvis and low back changed the way that it moved compared to what it looked like on the ground. And so it was tricky for me to kind of unravel that because I was working with like half of a puzzle piece. I wasn't necessarily diving in at the time to the horse's mechanics. And so I had this rider try a couple things in the saddle, and the typical things that I was having them do in the saddle to adjust their position was helping, but it wasn't helping a ton. And then I started asking questions about the horse just to get an idea, a little bit more of what else could be involved. What are the other variables? What's the saddle like? How's the saddle fit to this person? How is the stirrup length? How is the saddle pad fitting? How is the horse's spine? How is the horse's hip? And it just goes into this whole, like, big onion of, like, okay, is this a borrowed saddle? Is this your saddle? Is this typical saddle setup, or is it better when you're in a dressage saddle? Is it better when you're in a Western saddle? Is it better with shorter stirrups? And what ended up happening is that we kind of chatted and kind of tried to evolve the conversation a little bit to see what other factors could be impacting that hip because it just didn't seem like her anatomy was involved with it. And it ended up, we found out that the horse had a stifle injury on that left hind. And so they were not striding as mobile or they weren't having as much range of motion on the left hind end compared to the right. So when they're cantering to the right, that left hind was shorter and was causing the hip to have to take up more impact because it was not like moving as symmetrically as it should have been. And so that to me was my like light bulb of like, okay, well, when we talk about human anatomy, not talking about riders, when we talk about human anatomy and gait mechanics for the way that someone walks, we're typically looking at the way that the footfall lands because the way that our foot lands into the ground impacts the rest of the chain. And so we typically, if we're looking at someone having pain when they walk or having pain with certain running strides, we typically look at their footfall and the way that that impacts the rest of the chain. On the horse, we have two movement systems. So we have the horse and the rider. So if the horse is moving one way, it's going to impact the way that the rider moves and vice versa. Like we all have had that experience where you're changing the way that your body position is and your horse moves better all of a sudden. And so to me and my brain, it just made sense that needed and wanted to be able to look at both parties to be able to make each movement system make sense to me. And I don't necessarily treat both horse and rider for every case. I treat horses independently, I treat riders independently. But I will often ask, and like we had chatted about some history on the horse that you're riding, just so that I got a picture of like how your body is going to impact and be impacted from that, so that we can make sure that you and the horse are like a happy little system together.
Hi, everyone. It's your personal trainer, Ellie. If you're looking to become a stronger, more balanced, and flexible rider, I'm here to help. I offer virtual personal training sessions and customized workout plans that you can complete on your own. As a fellow competitor, I understand the physical demands riding requires, and my goal is to help you perform your best for your horse, whether you're preparing for a show or just want to improve your everyday rides. Visit lopindowntherailfitness.com or click on my website tab in the notes of this podcast episode to learn more. Let's work together to elevate your ride. Can you walk us through the process of how you evaluate someone and come up with a program for them? And you can use me as an example if you want.
Perfect. Yeah, so I have a pretty similar process with each of my riders. I will typically start with an on ground or an on horse assessment. So I'm typically chatting with the rider, getting some medical history. I typically get some medical history forms just so that I know about previous orthopedic stuff, previous surgeries, etc. And so I typically look at the way that the body is moving on the ground and looking at strength, range of motion. I know for you, we looked at your low back, your mid back, spine range of motion, your hip range of motion, and looking at the strength of this surrounding structure. So your paraspinal strength, your glute strength, your hip strength, and making sure that I'm taking those values into consideration, like having a little bit of hip weakness on one side versus another, and then translating that to see how that is in saddle. And so then after I get a good idea of how the body is moving on the ground, maybe we're talking about pain. For you, we talked a lot about history of your back injury and how you've changed what you do and what you do with your fitness training so that I had a good idea of what things you had modified, the things that you've already done so that I had a good idea of where we needed to go or maybe some gaps of things that we needed to fill. And then from there, I look at the rider in the saddle, typically on their horse that they're either having issues with or that they're working on competing or whatnot. So I want them to be on a horse that they're comfortable with, that it's their usual horse. And I watch them in a couple different directions. So I'll watch them on straight lines, I'll watch them on around turns, both directions. And then I want to see them in all gaits because I think sometimes we undervalue the walk, that there's a lot that I can see from the walk with riders. And sometimes you can see in the walk where it's obviously a slower gait, but you can already see the way that the pelvis shifts over. Like for you, we had a little bit of that pelvis coming more to the center of the saddle. And so we wanted to get that more symmetrical and getting that more square underneath where your shoulders were. And so I'll watch in all different directions and see, does that positioning change per direction or does it stay about the same? And I often see that if we're dealing with a hip weakness or a previous glute weakness or a low back soreness, that will stay consistent. So the rider doesn't necessarily shift out of that one position. They typically stay shifted one direction. Whereas for other things, I will see the crookedness or the shift change depending on the direction. And so I take video of this so that I have kind of record. And so we can dissect it a little bit more in slow motion. And then in the saddle, I like to see what things we can address to improve the coordination or the movement pattern that the rider has resolved to. So if your body is trying to compensate for a previous injury or a muscle weakness, or even like a coordination, like maybe you have difficulty with coordinating a leg on more strongly than another leg, then I want to bring in some what we call proprioception devices or some tools with either cueing a rider to kind of move their body in a certain way. For you, we used a resistance band across the body. And it really depends on where that weakness or discomfort is, on what tool we utilize, how often we're using it, and how long. So that we're allowing your body to have different input than it's used to, so that it gives your brain new information to say, oh, I actually need to shift my pelvis more underneath me, or I now feel that I'm super far on this side of my seatbelt and I need to be over in this part of the saddle. And so that way, if we can change your riding position in that short period of time, that gives me information on how we address it long term. Because I'm not going to suddenly be able to get people in one session. We're not going to strengthen a hip so much that they're never going to have an issue again. It just gives me
Right.
information of this. Can your body change the movement that we're dealing with? And how do we do that? And then give you a plan on how to be able to achieve it long term. So that's what I love is that, I get to try and make those short term changes so that we can see that, okay, your body can be more in balance, but how do we get it to stay there? How do we get this to maintain for you? Because this is a better position or it's more symmetrical or it gives you less discomfort. And that's kind of the general process of how I will work with someone. And then the follow up sessions kind of depend on what we're working on. So for you, we worked both in saddle and off horse. Some riders, I will see them in saddle and be like, that is the thing we need to work on. I don't need to see you ride for another couple sessions because we got some things to deal with on the ground. And obviously, they're still riding in the meantime, but I will typically tailor the follow up sessions depending on if we need them to be at horse. Like if the rider's doing pretty well, they're following an exercise program, but man, every time they do right turns, it's really hard for them to make that turn without collapsing. Then I get to spend the time in the arena talking about right hand turns. So I try to tailor it to be very individual, but my baseline assessment is fairly similar throughout.
Yeah, and, like you said, it just takes time. So that first
Hmm.
time that you came out to evaluate Savannah, my horse trainer, and I think it was sometime in January, so it was right around 6 months ago, and the first time that you came out, I was like, "Man, my injury was, like, almost 4 years ago, and I'm still having this pain, and I'm still having these instabilities that I don't want while I'm riding." And I feel like I had gotten myself pretty far with my knowledge as a personal trainer, but I realized that there were pieces that I was still missing and I couldn't figure out what those pieces were. So that was why I reached out to you and was like, "All right, Michelle, like it's time. I need some external help, right? Like I can't do it all myself." So I had you come out and at that time I was really struggling putting like even like weight in my left seat bone, and
Hmm.
then I was putting way too much weight in my right stirrup to compensate. So my
Yeah,
I would be fairly center on the horse, but my saddle would be, like, way to the right.
I
And I
remember.
was
I
having
remember those days for you.
it was so awful. I was like, "This is so embarrassing, so embarrassing. This is horrible." And
It
I
was not
couldn't post.
horrible. It was just the way
Oh.
your body had compensated.
Oh, Michelle, it was so horrible. You're being too kind. Um, and then because my saddle was so far over, I literally could not post out, and I'm like, "I have a big horse show in a couple of months, and I need to, like, figure this out," right? So, from that day, you were like, "Alright, we really need to strengthen, like, your lateral stability and your left glute
Mhm.
medius," and I remember thinking, like, I had not even thought of that as potentially being my problem. That solution had literally not dawned on me at all. And so you went and you evaluated me, like my glute medius strength and stability. And I was like, holy crap, I did not
Mhm.
realize how weak I had let myself get there. Like, I feel like in riding and in fitness, it's like you take 2 steps forward and you take 1 step back in the process. You know what I mean? Like, I
Always.
feel like I was so focused on a couple of other things that I had let that piece of the puzzle kinda get left behind. And so I needed you to kind of be like, "Hey, like, you're doing these things well, but you need to do these things better." And so you gave me a program that really focused on my glute medius strength and stability, and the funny thing was, as we started working more and more, I kind of started to notice some of the same things in my clients. Like, I just
Yeah.
realized that that was a missing piece out of my program that I needed to, one, implement more on myself, but also implement more in my program. That was just a piece of the puzzle that I was missing. And now that
Yeah.
I have that piece, I feel like it's so much better. So now that it's 6 months later that I've been doing those physical therapy exercises, pretty consistently 4 to 5 times a week, I feel like there's still a long way to go, but I'm so much happier with where I am now. And then I think it was like 2 or 3 months ago, you came
Mhm.
out and you evaluated us again
Yeah.
and saw that I had a lot more evenness and a lot more strength and stability in that glute med. But
So
then I
much
was
more.
kinda having another problem of my left hip was just being too locked up and not moving, like, it was locked backwards and I
Mhm.
couldn't get it to push forward. And I remember showing you, I was like, "Look, like, when I make a right turn, whether it's a haunch turn or at the walk, the trot, the lope, it doesn't matter. I just feel stuck, and I feel like I can't use the right side of my body. I feel like I can't push the horse around. The horse is bending to the outside. A lot of times I pick up the wrong lead with the horse on that direction, like, something is just stuck." And I remember you told me to think about, like, pushing that left hip forward, and I was like, "Oh my god, duh." But I
There it
hadn't thought
is.
of that.
Yeah, the left hip was it you had a really hard time bringing your hip forward around turns, and so I remember the cue we had for you was to, like wasn't it a laser beam cue? It was, like,
Yes. The
to
laser
bring
beam
your right
on my
hip to
hip.
laser beam because you would drop the hip bone in the front of
Yeah.
the hip, and so I had you laser beam around a turn and it worked, which was great. And the
Yeah.
horse you were on was gave us great feedback too, because she would change when you changed your body. And so when we
Yeah.
knew we were doing it, we knew we got it when she stayed and maintained her positioning. And I think that, the fitness professionals and physical therapists collaborate so often in like the traditional medicine circle, because if we're talking traditional in hospital or outpatient physical therapy, I'm typically discharging clients to go to their fitness instructor then and making sure that we're continuing the plan of care and continuing with strength training
Yeah.
and giving guidelines of like, this is where I'm okay with you having a little discomfort because your body's not used to loading this muscle. And this is where we're not okay doing more or having more discomfort. And so that's what I like. It's so fun to work with you as a client because you know the fitness realm so well and can carry over the rest of that
Yeah.
programming to say, okay, I can get the rest of the whole body. And we know that we need to work on accessory things here. And for you,
Yeah.
it was through glute med and making sure that we got your position from actually using your pelvis more symmetrically in the saddle, because you had kind of my working idea on what happened for you is shift that you ended up having to shift your body to alleviate some low back discomfort. And then your back discomfort had calmed down, but that positioning didn't change. And
Yeah.
so I got to step in and help you change that, and you took it the rest of the way. So that's
Yeah.
the fun of collaboration.
It's been a lot of fun. Like, it's, not gonna lie, that first month of strengthening that glute med again, I was like, "This is horrible. This is
Like, what did
terrible."
I just sign myself up for?
Oh my god. I remember so Savannah and I would always, twice a week, we would do our physical therapy exercises together over, like, a Zoom call to,
That's
like,
so
help
fun.
motivate each other, and, we would both be doing, like, the sideline hip abductors together
Yeah,
and just be like, holy shit, this is horrible."
that's so funny. But you kept each other accountable.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and I remember being like, "I have to do 12 side planks every day. What
Yes,
the heck, Michelle?"
you're welcome.
And Savannah would be like, "I have to do 36 leg lifts." Like, it was oh, it was so funny.
But that
But
that type of having that structure though to have someone keep you accountable is so important, and you guys
yeah,
put the work in to see change, which is great.
yep, and we still do that twice a week. Every week, we have our little Zoom calls and we do our PT together.
Proud of you guys.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Are you looking for that extra competitive edge, struggling with show pin anxiety, or looking to set and achieve meaningful goals with your horse? Schedule a session with me, Lauren, your dedicated mindset coach. As an experienced competitor, I understand the mental demands required to excel at the highest level, and am here to support you in building a plan to help you stay accountable and reaching those goals. For more information, check out laurencervelli.com or click on the website link in our show notes. Let's work together to elevate your ride.
So, what are the biggest problem areas that you see most equestrians struggle with?
I would say
Yeah.
like number one is typically lateral stability, whether that's upper body or lower body, so pelvis, hips, or trunk. So if you think about the way that riders move through space is typically forward and maybe sometimes backwards if you're backing a horse, but you're typically moving forward. So you're using your hip flexors, using your glutes, or using your hamstrings, a little bit of inner thigh. We don't want to be gripping, but like you need some stability so that there is some activity of your adductors. And typically we're not going really outside of that positioning unless your horse is doing extravagant extracurricular activities where they're hopping and leaping, which is when you really want to have good lateral stability because you're keeping
Right.
yourself in the saddle. But for the most part, we're not really moving laterally in space at all. And that would be like moving side to side. Yes, we do like a yield or haunch in or shoulder in or whatnot, but that is still moving forward regardless. Like you're moving slightly laterally for the horse. The horse is moving more laterally than we do as riders. And so what I tend to find is that there tends to be a lack of lateral hip stability in riders if they don't consciously exercise or strength train outside of riding. And if you think of other more traditional sports like football, soccer, basketball, volleyball, those athletes, while they have a certain way of moving, like they're always doing a certain type of movement depending on their position, whether that's sprinting, running, jogging, kicking, they're typically training outside of their sport to ensure that they are not putting themselves at a higher injury risk by not training the other parts of them. So if they are not getting very much overhead work, so if you're talking about a lot of runners or footballers, if they're not doing a lot of overhead pressing, they're still in the gym doing that motion because they are not getting that in their daily sport. We don't really have, I mean, I think there's a building culture of riders that are building strength outside of riding, and that is where we want to make sure that our athletes are training in the positions that they're not getting in the saddle. So making sure that they are training some upper body, make sure that they are training some lateral hip strengthening, because those are areas that are naturally going to be weaker because we're not using them as much. And I think that is a big common theme that I often see for riders. And it does resolve quite a bit of things.
Yeah, I mean, if somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, like, I'm having trouble with my two pointing and my posting and I need to strengthen my legs," I'm not just gonna strengthen their legs, right? Like, I'm gonna
Exactly.
give them a full body workout and a leg workout. Like, I'm not just gonna strengthen one part of the body because that's exactly how you create muscle imbalances and how you
Mhm.
create strength deficiencies and how you go away from being functional. And being
Right.
functional is the most important part. If you can't be functional in your daily life and in your riding, then what's the point of building the strength at all?
Exactly. And it's so important to like, we think of how we want to be in the saddle and how we want to ride, and adding that out of saddle training is what keeps us moving throughout our lives without discomfort and reducing our injury risk. But the amount of physical things that we have to do as equestrians in this sport, the lifting of grain, the picking up of buckets, the moving of horses to different pastures and things, the physical things that we have to do throughout the day just for the lifestyle of horseback riding, that is also where we're gonna see the benefit of strength training. So, yes, we want people to be performing well in saddle, but there's so much more to the strength baseline that can benefit us just on our daily activity that we have as equestrians.
Yeah, for sure. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you recommend equestrians do for injury prevention?
This is one of my favorite questions.
Yes.
Um, I so injury prevention gets a lot of, I think we see a lot about this on social media about reducing our injury risk, or like this is the perfect exercise to reduce hip pain, or this is the perfect exercise so that you don't injure your hamstrings. I would say that what has been well researched and thoroughly assessed for injury prevention is has very little to do with a specific exercise. It's so much more than that. The top things for reducing injury risk is actually stress management, sleep. I'm talking adequate sleep, so not 4 hours before a horse show. Sleep has been hugely correlated with injury risk. So if we are constantly not resting our body and having that restorative amount of sleep, then we're already putting ourselves at a baseline of having not only more injury, but a longer recovery because we're still not getting restful sleep and allowing ourselves to recover. So stress management, sleep, talking like 7 to 9 hours, kind of depends on the person, and having it consistent. So looking at circadian rhythms of like waking up at a similar time, going to sleep at a similar time, which is like, I don't know, I think some people kind of roll their eyes at that and they're like, yeah, 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 I'll sleep more. Let me go drink more coffee. But it's true. Like there is actual data on this, on like reducing your stressors, making sure that you're getting adequate sleep, and then making sure that you're getting adequate nutrition as well. So we're talking hydration appropriately as well as nutrition and food, because if we are not getting adequate protein throughout our day or adequate carbohydrates, so adequate fuel in general for our bodies, it is a lot harder to recover from injury, but it is also putting us at a higher risk for musculoskeletal injury. So I'm talking muscle tissue or any sort of soft tissue injury, ligamentous tendon, muscle, that is at a higher risk if we are not managing those. So that doesn't even have anything to do with us being in the gym. There's a ton of data supporting strength training as also helping reduce injury, but I like to talk about that baseline first. So making sure that if we've got those things in our control managed, so if we are managing the stress that we can, and that's mental stress, that is physical stress. So making sure that we're not overdoing ourselves and overloading ourselves, sleep management, and looking at our nutrition appropriately, making sure we are eating enough substantial food that's healthy, nutritious, and is able to sustain us through a full day. So we're eating throughout our day and not just, having a coffee before we go into the show ring. Once we have those, next step is looking at strength training. So I'm talking about what we were just chatting with about making sure that our exercise training off horse supports what we are not necessarily doing in saddle. So making sure that if we're in saddle and we're not getting much lateral motion, we need to make sure we are getting lateral strengthening outside of the saddle. We're not getting very much overhead press motion. We're not getting very much tricep exercise. We need to make sure that those muscles are still being activated and strengthened outside of riding. And so making sure that we have a consistent strength program. When we're looking at exercise fitness program, like step one is making sure that we have something that we enjoy to do and doing that consistently. It's something that we can do readily and happily. Because if you are going to a cycling class and you hate cycling, you're not going to do that consistently. So finding a movement
Yeah.
that you find enjoyable outside of the riding. So it can be group classes, it can be individual classes. Like that's kind of step one. I do recommend strength training for a lot of people because there is a lot of benefit from it, from a bone health benefit, from a cardiovascular fitness benefit, from an overall strength gain benefit. So I really encourage riders that if we're trying to reduce injury, you're going to look at those things that we talked about: is managing stress, nutrition, and strength training of some kind. Those are the biggies, and those are supported by research.
I actually had a question going back to earlier. You had mentioned that you were talking about gripping and needing to keep your upper thighs maybe a little bit looser on the horse and moving, and how that's kind of a problem that you run across. I started a new kind of a class called the pleasure. And that's one thing that they're constantly telling me is because the classes I used to do were based on having like a strong kind of, I don't want to say stiff, but quiet body, and I get to gripping with my thighs and they're always saying loosen up because otherwise the horse gets tight, get loose. From your perspective, why is gripping like that bad for you personally as a rider? And then what does it do to the horse?
Ooh, that's a good question. I That is a pattern that I will often see. I see it in both jumpers and in Western riders that as you change into more of that, because are you doing pleasure class?
Yeah, so I'm moving from horsemanship to transitioning to Western pleasure riding.
Okay. And that's where you have been working on reducing that tension in the thigh, correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I was just making sure I knew which way you were going. Yeah, I typically will find that I think a lot of riders tend to think that we need more adductor or that like inner thigh activation to keep themselves stable than we typically do. And if you are guarding with that inner hip, you're typically going to kick on your hip flexor a little bit too. So your hip angle changes. So if you think about you're looking at a rider and they get more hip flexor activated, that means their knee is going to move up towards the top of the saddle. So the gripping not only adds compression into the saddle, but it also brings that hip flexor on to go upward as well. And so I see it in sometimes in like dressage riders that have like knee blocks as well. Like riders will have these knee blocks on their saddles that keep their thigh at a certain position, but it actually makes them push into it more sometimes. And so that positioning itself doesn't allow you to get your natural pelvis positioning to where if you were to relax your leg, you'd feel balanced. So a lot of times we're like holding that position to maintain like an upright posture and making sure we're staying balanced. But it's not typically we're working really, really hard to maintain that position. And we want riders to feel comfortable and fluid in their position so that they can move along with the horse. And so that's what that gripping can sometimes do. It can make you more rigid as a rider and reduce some of the pelvis motion and create more of a smaller hip angle. And if you're not moving as fluidly as the rider, then you're going to take more impact from the horse when they start to move. And I'm talking impact is not like plyometric jumping off a box type of impact, but you're just absorbing their motion more rigidly. And that in itself, I tend to see that for riders tends to have more of an effect in the upper part of their mid back is when riders end up having some discomfort there because they're like absorbing the motion in the lower pelvis. They're not using the motion of the hips. And so they are using that force that ends up going up more in the middle of their back. And it either means they're going to wiggle or it means that they're just going to have more discomfort in that region. So that's typically what I see for a lot of riders that ride more rigidly. So if we are transitioning from having more of a rigid position to more of a fluid position, the goal is that you should be able to absorb the horse's motion more fluidly with your body, which means that you have to have more muscle strength to be relaxed at baseline, if that makes sense. Because if you're trying to, you're not necessarily having a baseline like rigidity of your muscles. So you're not like holding your position as aggressively, but you have to be able to have the abdominal strength to keep yourself upright and balanced while your muscles in your legs are more relaxed. So you're using less and recruiting less muscles from your lower legs, but still keeping your body in the same position, which tends to be more like abdominals and back musculature and glutes.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense when you explain it that way. And it's really interesting too that you were talking about how the hip flexors become engaged because he was just telling me, yeah, your knees start creeping up when you get tight like that. And I loved how you that was one of the first things that you pointed out. So there is like an actual biomechanics happening. And so that was super interesting. We ended up dropping my stirrups 2 holes, I mean, which is maybe a half an inch, but that seemed to make a difference too. Was that something that could come into play, or was that just maybe I was starting to figure it out and write a little better there
There's a correlation for sure. Well, tell me a little bit more. When did you change the stirrups before you were having the issue or after?
after?
And then that helped resolve the issue?
Yes, it's starting to get better. I mean, I've only had 3 lessons where I've worked on this new type of class, so it's still really new and trying to figure it all out. But that was one of the steps that we kind of tried to implement to see if it would make a difference, and it seemed to help me flow.
Yeah, I think lowering stirrups can be really helpful just because it gives your brain a like, okay, I gotta mentally reach for this. The other thing that I actually really like for some of that gripping, and I say gripping is not like a negative thing here. It's just changing the position of your leg from being more actively toned to being less tight. So your hip flexor is really closely inserted to your diaphragm. And so one of the best things that I have looked at and worked on with riders is reducing some of that hip flexor tension by doing deep breathing while they're riding. So if you're thinking of like yoga breathing, like where you're expanding your stomach, that actually can help reduce the tension in the hip flexor just by having that like diaphragm start to move because you're working on an innervation very closely to where that hip flexor is. And so that is something I would toy with in the next ride that you have because when you are starting to feel those like knees start to come up, it can be something that can be really helpful where you're just thinking about deep breathing and then relaxing those hip flexors will come secondary to that without you having to really think about it.
Awesome. I absolutely love that because I always preach the diaphragmatic breathing too when it comes to just relaxing and being a more present writer too. So that's awesome that it's got that other kind of key element that is going to help in this new class that I'm trying. So thank you for explaining that. Great. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. That hip flexor trick has worked really well. I've had a couple people that I've had a jump rider that had trouble with that hip kind of creeping up as they got closer to the jump. And they were on a horse that was a little bit known to stop. And so they also got like a little bit nervous about it too. So they started to get some nerves around it, but then their body would react with that hip flexor kind of coming up to help the rider like protect themselves. And once we were able to actually have her like deep belly breathe at the base of a jump, which sounds really complicated and it was at the time, then she was able to break out of that like hip flexor tightness cycle, which really helped her feel more confident too. So it's all in one, like something that can be really helpful for like the mental component so that you're more present, but then it also can help reduce some of the pelvis tension.
That's amazing. Love that. Thank you for that little piece of knowledge. I'm thrilled.
Yeah, happy to help.
Hey, Elevate Your Ride fans. Are you loving our show and looking for a way to show your support? Check out our line of Elevate Your Ride merchandise. From stylish t shirts to cozy hoodies to journals and hats, we have everything you need to represent your favorite podcast. Ready to gear up? Click on the Buy Our Merchandise Here link in the podcast notes, or head on over to our website, elevateyourride.co, and click on the Store tab. Thank you for your support. Make sure to like, follow, and share our platform with your friends.
So, Michelle, what is
Yes.
one PSA you wish you could say or explain to like all equestrians, all riders?
Ooh, I mean, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir with you guys is that, like, I think one of the most undervalued things that we can do for ourselves, our bodies, and our health is to not incorporate strength training. So I would love for riders to incorporate strength training to whatever capacity works for them. And I'm talking about time, accessibility, what equipment they have available, what time availability they have as a professional, as an amateur, as a trainer. I would love riders to incorporate strength training that's going to complement their writing and add to their writing, because that is going to be huge, not only for their own performance, but for their own health. And it's something that our industry is starting to have conversation about, but it's been a needed conversation for a while. So I'm grateful that you have gathered this group and this community to be able to talk more about the importance of rider health and fitness, because it is such a needed area. And to have a solid strength program that benefits your health as a human, but also your performance as a rider is really invaluable. And I don't think enough riders take that into account.
Can you explain a little bit biomechanically why the strength training is so important? I know that you touched a little bit on why it's important for bone health and cardiovascular health and strengthening your joints and your muscles and your ligaments, but can you give like some concrete, maybe sort of evidence-based
Yeah.
suggestions as to like cuz I feel like all the time we hear like, "Oh, you should strength train," and people are like, "Ah, yeah, whatever." But I feel like if people actually understand why, they're more likely to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So obviously, we have American sports medicine recommendations of how much physical activity you should be doing throughout your week, mild, moderate, highly active. Those are baseline metrics that have already been established and they're like nationally based on the way that your body benefits from cardiovascular fitness and musculoskeletal health. There are baseline guidances on how much activity you should have based on the type and intensity of activity that you can do, want to do, have available to you. And those are made specifically to maximize and optimize your health as a human. When we're talking about riding and equestrians, we're typically doing quite a bit of walking fitness, lifting. We're typically doing riding. So you have already ingrained for many of us kind of several times a week riding activity that you're doing. From a fitness standpoint, so when you are riding your horse and you are going through your either baseline course, you're going through a pleasure class, or you're doing a horsemanship pattern, you're typically going to challenge your system to what you train it to. So if your body is used to just riding, then that is kind of maxing your fitness level and riding capacity. And so anytime that you get more challenge physically, whether that's with a horse that's a little more fresh, or it is with a longer ride, or several rides in a day at a show, that is where you're kind of maxing out some of your systems to where you're maybe not training enough for that. And so that's where people get really fatigued at shows because they're not used to having to ride to that level. And so their body's just like really tired. The way that we can combat that is actually by using strength training and cardiovascular fitness. So I'm talking cardio to some degree, whether that is treadmill running or walking, elliptical, biking, walking, doing some sort of incline. Strength training also works for cardio. The tricky thing about that is that you want to be, I guess, balancing the things that you're doing outside the saddle to complement you from in the saddle. And so if we are training out of the saddle to get our heart rate to a higher level, so if we're working on building our cardiovascular base, so we're riding for 30 minutes, that is cardio work. But if you are used to cycling or biking or hiking for 40 minutes or an hour, maybe when you do have to ride a little bit longer, you're maybe riding for those 40 minutes, your body's going to be like, oh, I can accommodate some of this. So you're still going to be efficient as a system. When we're talking about strength training outside the saddle, we're talking about progressive overload, which is when you are adding resistance in intervals to build muscle strength and slightly challenge the muscle. So you're getting these little tiny micro tears to grow your muscle. So you don't want to go too much because then you go into like the injury or tear area, but you want micro tears. You want small amounts of overload. So that typically looks like if you can do a bicep curl with 5 pounds, then you can do 15 bicep curls with a 5 pound weight. When you are progressively overloading that, that means that maybe we do, if you can do 15 at 5 pounds, maybe we see how many we can do at 7.5, or maybe we do a couple rounds of the 15. And so it just allows you to challenge those muscles in a way that allows you to develop strength without creating injury, but building your strength so that you're building your muscles to be more resilient. And that's appropriate for riding, but it's also appropriate for like functional daily life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about the orthopedic benefits and that sort of thing as well?
Oh my gosh, there's so many benefits to strength training. Some of the biggest benefits from exercise come from strength training. So I'm talking about using weight, moving weight. You can use machines for that as well, but we typically are wanting some sort of resistance. The benefit to that is that you're reducing likelihood of tendon-based injuries because you are loading those muscles. You are improving the stability of a joint because you are building muscle strength, which those muscles turn into tendons, which then go around the joints. So you're getting your muscles that are surrounding a joint to be stronger. You're typically improving the synovial fluid within the joint because you're moving your joint more. So if you're doing bicep curls, your elbow joint is going to get more fluidity through the actual synovial fluid, which is the fluid within your joint capsule. So that in itself is going to be helpful. When you are strength training, you also want to work through a range of motion. So we'll use our bicep curl example again. I don't know how often we're always bending our elbow as far as we can and then straightening our elbow as far as we can. But when you are doing it repeatedly, you are getting that full range of motion and making sure that you don't lose range that you didn't know you were losing. So if you all of a sudden lost some of that range of motion, you'll be able to identify it because you will have already been used to doing that motion. You're like, oh, today it feels a little more stiff. I didn't know I was stiff in my elbow. Today I am, whereas I wasn't a couple days ago. So it gives you a little more insight into kind of checking into your body. I think our sport as equestrians often has a high population of female riders. As women, that tends to create actual bone density loss as we age with perimenopausal, premenopausal, and menopausal women. And so strength training is one of the best ways to reduce bone loss. And I think a lot of people think about impact with like walking or running, but that only helps your axial skeleton. So it only helps your legs into your pelvis. What about your arms and your upper chest and your neck? So those areas are benefited by doing strength training with weight overhead or using it for your arms because you're getting the leverage. So you're improving bone density with strength training or maintaining it. Strength training tends to be one of the first things that people incorporate when they are dealing with bone density loss because it is not only going to maintain your bone health, but there has been some early research of it improving it, which is great. So start strength training young and continue it because you'll maintain your bone strength and density. It helps with metabolism because the physiology of your metabolism will change when you are increasing the amount of muscle that you have compared to compared to fats in your body. Fats are not inherently bad, but if you have a higher muscle baseline, so if your muscle bulk is leaner, you will metabolize your food more efficiently. And there's quite a bit of research on how that incorporates and manages things like insulin levels. So exercise tends to be combative for a lot of baseline conditions as well. If we're talking about metabolism, if we're talking about cardiovascular things, there's not a lot of things that exercise is not encouraged for. It tends to be a helper for a lot of things. And strength training tends to be a very safe way to do that.
I think that you did a great job explaining all of that, and for sure, that's why lifting weights is one of the best ways to lose weight is because you're speeding up your boosting your metabolism for sure, and you're building musculoskeletal muscle, and it's so important for your body's overall health. And, it's a great thing to do. I recommend everybody do it.
Thank you for listening to Elevate Your Ride. Find us on Instagram and Facebook, all linked in the podcast notes. We'll see you next time. The information provided by Elevate Your Ride is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical or professional advice. While we discuss health and fitness topics related to equestrians, the content provided through this podcast is not a substitute for professional advice. The views expressed by the host and guests on Elevate Your Ride are their own and should not be taken as professional guidance. We strive to provide accurate and up to date information, but we cannot guarantee that the information will be applicable to every individual listener or that it reflects the most current research or guidelines. Before making any changes to your health and fitness routine, we strongly recommend consulting with a qualified professional who can provide personalized advice based on your individual needs and circumstances. Elevate Your Ride and its creators will not be liable for any direct, indirect, consequential, special, exemplary, or other damages arising from the use of information on this podcast. Thank you for listening to Elevate Your Ride. We are committed to providing high quality content and appreciate your trust in us as a source of information for your health and fitness journey.